At 13 p.m. on January 25, 1945, war does not reward creativity until desperation removes every other option. In the final stretch of the conflict, when supply lines were thin, air superiority was unreliable, and command structures were collapsing under pressure, one infantry unit found itself facing a problem that doctrine had never prepared them for. Enemy armor was advancing through broken terrain where tanks could not follow and artillery could not be repositioned fast enough. The battlefield was a maze of ruins, burned-out vehicles, collapsed walls, and craters filled with rainwater and oil. Every traditional solution failed within minutes. Anti-tank rifles lacked penetration. Handheld explosives required suicidal proximity. Mines were useless because the ground was constantly shifting under bombardment. Retreat was discussed briefly, then dismissed because behind them there was nothing left to retreat to. The men understood something before any order was given. If they did nothing unconventional, they would be erased conventionally. The idea did not arrive with confidence or clarity. It emerged the way dangerous thoughts usually do, quietly, almost accidentally. A damaged field gun lay half-buried near a destroyed logistics truck. Its carriage twisted, its wheels shattered. It was written off as scrap, just another casualty of artillery fire. But one soldier stared at it longer than the others. He noticed the barrel was intact. The breech still functioned. The ammunition, heavy and impractical, was still stacked nearby. That was when the question was spoken aloud, not as a plan, but as a challenge to reality itself. What if this wasn't artillery anymore? First, the reaction was laughter. Nervous, exhausted laughter. The kind soldiers used to survive ideas too frightening to consider seriously. A field gun was not a weapon you aimed with your body. It was not something you stabilized with sandbags and muscle. It was not something you fired from cover. Everyone there knew the recoil alone could shatter bones. The muzzle blast could blind or kill. The accuracy would be laughable. And yet, the laughter faded quickly, because no one offered a better idea. Command was unreachable. Radio contact was intermittent. The enemy was advancing whether doctrine approved or not. That night, under cover of darkness and smoke, they dragged the gun into the shadow of a collapsed building. There was no official permission, no blueprint, no safety calculation. Only hands, tools, and the unspoken agreement that if this failed, history would never record their names. They stripped away what was broken. They removed what was unnecessary. The carriage was cut free with crude tools. Metal was bent, not engineered. Wooden beams were scavenged from doors and floors. Sandbags were stacked not for protection, but to keep the weapon from killing its operators. This was not innovation in the modern sense. It was adaptation under threat of extinction. During the first test, everyone stood farther back than necessary. No one wanted to be close when the impossible happened. The round was chambered with shaking hands. The breech locked with a sound that echoed too loudly in the ruined street. When it fired, the shockwave flattened dust and debris in a wide arc. The weapon slammed backward violently, tearing free from one of its restraints. One man was thrown to the ground. Another screamed, not from pain, but from shock. For several seconds, no one moved. Then they saw the target, an abandoned armored hull used as a reference point, torn open in a way none of their infantry weapons had ever achieved. The penetration was not clean. It was brutal. Steel peeled outward. Internal components were shredded. Silence followed, heavier than the explosion itself. They had done something that should not have worked. And that was the most dangerous realization of all. Because once soldiers learn that the rules can be broken, they stop asking whether they should. They only ask whether they must. From that moment on, the gun was no longer scrap. It was no longer artillery. It became a question aimed directly at the enemy. How do you prepare for something that was never supposed to exist? Before we continue, understand this clearly. Stories like this are not about heroism polished by time. They are about choices made when survival outweighs regulation. If you want more real war stories where soldiers rewrote reality under fire, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of the story only gets more dangerous. By dawn, the weapon had a new role, a new crew, and an unspoken rule. No one outside the unit was to know exactly how it worked, because if command discovered it, it would be shut down. And if the enemy discovered it, they would adapt. The men did not sleep. They reinforced the bracing. They practiced loading under stress. They learned how to stand, where to brace, how to angle their bodies so the recoil would throw them backward instead of snapping them in half. Injuries were accepted as part of the process. Fear was not. Every adjustment made the weapon slightly less lethal to its users and slightly more lethal to its targets. And somewhere between exhaustion and adrenaline, the unit crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They were no longer just infantry. They were operators of something history never intended to be written down. The weapon was never meant to evolve, but once it existed, it demanded refinement. After the first firing, the men understood a brutal truth. What they had created could kill the enemy, but it could just as easily kill them. That balance had to change. Not toward safety, safety was impossible, but toward control. Control was the only thing standing between a terrifying experiment and a usable battlefield weapon. They began by studying the recoil like a living force. Each shot slammed backward with unpredictable violence, twisting restraints, shifting sandbags, cracking improvised supports. So they changed how the energy moved. They angled the base into rubble so the ground absorbed part of the force. They added layered materials, wood, cloth, metal, not because they were strong, but because they failed differently, bleeding energy instead of snapping instantly. Every change was tested not on paper but on bodies. The operators learned through pain. Bruises mapped the recoil pattern. Burns marked where the muzzle blast reached. Ears rang permanently, but hearing loss was considered acceptable. Death was not. Reloading became a ritual. One man stabilized. One loaded. One watched the surroundings. Timing mattered more than speed. Panic caused mistakes, and mistakes around a weapon like this were fatal. They practiced under fire, because practice without fear taught nothing. Ammunition was limited, so every shot had to matter. There would be no suppressive fire, no warning shots. This weapon existed for one purpose only, to destroy something that believed itself immune. As the days passed, rumors spread through nearby units. Something was hitting armor where nothing should. Penetrations were appearing at impossible angles. Crews abandoned vehicles without understanding why. Enemy reconnaissance noted damage inconsistent with known weapons. Command dismissed it as misreported artillery or lucky strikes. That disbelief was a shield the unit relied on. If higher command intervened, the weapon would be confiscated or destroyed. If the enemy understood it, countermeasures would follow. Secrecy became doctrine. The crew changed positions constantly. The weapon was disassembled and moved in pieces. It was never fired twice from the same location. Each engagement lasted seconds, not minutes. Fire once. Relocate. Disappear. The psychological effect was immediate. Enemy units began hesitating in terrain they had previously crossed confidently. Armor advanced slower. Infantry hugged cover longer. Something unseen was hunting them, something that did not fit their tactical expectations. That uncertainty killed more momentum than explosions ever could. But the cost was rising. Each use degraded the weapon further. Cracks appeared in stressed components. Metal warped, wood splintered. Every shot carried the risk of catastrophic failure. The crew knew there would be a final firing, a moment when the weapon would destroy itself. They accepted this without discussion. That inevitability shaped how it was used. Targets were chosen carefully. The weapon was not wasted on lightly armored vehicles or exposed infantry. It waited for the moments that mattered most. Breakthrough attempts. Command vehicles. Heavy armor leading an advance. When it fired, it changed the flow of battle in ways no one could officially explain. Reports became contradictory. Maps no longer matched reality. Enemy planners adjusted for threats that didn't exist while ignoring the one that did. And all the while, the men operating the weapon were changing too. They stopped seeing it as insane. It became normal, familiar, almost trusted, which was the most dangerous stage of all. Because confidence around something this unstable bred complacency. And complacency on a battlefield always collects payment. The near miss came without warning. A shot fired slightly off angle. A restraint failed half a second too early. The recoil slammed the barrel sideways, crushing part of the support structure. Shrapnel tore through the position. One man was injured badly enough to be pulled from the crew permanently. Another was deafened instantly. The weapon survived, but barely. That night, the crew sat in silence, not discussing whether to continue, but how long they realistically could. The answer was clear: not much longer. Yet the enemy was adapting.
Armor formation tightened.
Routes changed. Counter-battery fire intensified in areas where strange impacts had been reported. Time was running out on both sides. The weapon had shifted from an advantage to a liability, not because it stopped working, but because the world around it was finally beginning to notice. The men understood that what they had built was never meant to last. It was a momentary distortion in the logic of war, a flaw in the system, and flaws, once detected, are corrected. They prepared for the final phase without saying it aloud. The remaining ammunition was counted. Targets were prioritized. Escape routes were planned. Destruction protocols were agreed upon. The weapon would not be captured, ever, because if it was studied, replicated, refined, it would stop being a desperate improvisation and become doctrine. And that, to them, felt worse than destruction. They were not inventors. They were survivors. And survivors know when to let go of the thing that kept them alive. The next engagement would decide everything, not just for the unit, but for the strange, violent idea they had dragged into existence from the ruins. The next engagement did not begin with gunfire. It began with waiting, the kind that stretches time until every sound feels deliberate. The crew positioned themselves before dawn, long before the enemy columns appeared. They chose a location that looked useless on a map. Broken elevation, scattered debris, no clear lines of fire. But they understood something maps didn't show. Armor trusted open ground and predictable resistance. This place offered neither. The weapon was assembled piece by piece, hands moving automatically now, each man knowing his role without instruction. No one spoke. Words felt unnecessary, almost dangerous. The weapon no longer felt experimental. It felt inevitable, like a storm that had already decided where it would strike. When the enemy finally came into view, it was exactly as expected. Heavy vehicles at the front, infantry screening the flanks, command elements safely behind steel and distance. A formation designed to crush resistance through certainty. They advanced with confidence, unaware that confidence itself was being measured. The crew waited until the lead vehicle committed to the narrowest section of the route, where turning back would cause chaos and pushing forward would compress the formation. This was not about destruction alone. It was about disruption. The first shot was perfectly timed. The round did not simply hit the lead vehicle. It arrived from an angle that made no sense. Armor designed to deflect incoming fire failed catastrophically. The penetration was immediate and terminal. The vehicle did not burn at first. It stopped, dead weight blocking everything behind it. For several seconds, nothing else happened. That pause was more damaging than the explosion. Enemy infantry froze, unsure whether this was artillery, an ambush, or something entirely new. Then the second shot came. A command vehicle farther back, struck before it could react. Antennas vanished. Internal equipment was shredded. Whatever coordination existed seconds earlier dissolved instantly. The formation collapsed inward, exactly as the crew had predicted. Panic spread faster than any round. Orders conflicted. Vehicles attempted to reposition in terrain that did not allow it. Infantry dismounted too late, exposing themselves to small arms fire from other units exploiting the confusion. The weapon fired again, and again, each shot chosen, never wasted. The recoil battered the crew mercilessly, but they held. Pain was irrelevant now. Adrenaline erased it. The weapon was no longer just destroying targets. It was rewriting the battlefield. Enemy forces reacted with overwhelming force. Counter-battery fire slammed into surrounding structures. The ground shook. Debris rained down. The crew knew this was the window they had anticipated, the moment when surprise burned brightest and shortest. They fired the final planned shot and immediately began dismantling the weapon under fire. Movements were frantic but precise. Components were dragged, buried, or destroyed. Charges were placed where recovery would be impossible. The crew split and vanished into preplanned routes just as the enemy saturated the position with fire. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing to capture. No intact weapon. No clear explanation. Only wrecked vehicles and unanswered questions. The aftermath was worse than the engagement itself. Enemy intelligence could not classify what had happened. Reports contradicted physics. Damage assessments didn't match known weapon profiles. Command blamed errors, coincidence, exaggerated accounts. But the fear remained. Armor avoided similar terrain. Advances slowed. Units hesitated where hesitation had never existed before. A temporary paralysis spread through planning staffs. That pause saved lives elsewhere on the front. But for the crew, survival came with consequences. They were scattered, reassigned, absorbed into other units. No official recognition followed. No documentation recorded what they had done. The weapon became a rumor, then a myth, then a footnote dismissed by historians who preferred cleaner explanations. And yet, something fundamental had changed. The men who survived carried the knowledge that war was not only won by superior technology, but by moments of controlled insanity, when someone dared to ignore what was possible. The weapon was gone, but its impact lingered. Enemy doctrine adjusted quietly. Armor formations changed spacing. Routes avoided confinement. Training manuals were updated with vague language about unexpected threats. No one ever named the cause. They didn't need to. The distortion had already occurred. A single unit, a single idea had forced an entire system to bend. And systems do not forget that kind of pressure. Long after the crew dispersed, long after the battlefield moved on, officers would reference unexplained losses in that sector. Analysts would argue. Engineers would propose countermeasures to weapons that officially did not exist. And somewhere in those discussions, without realizing it, they were responding to a field gun that had refused to stay artillery. The men themselves rarely spoke of it. When they did, it was without pride. Pride implies choice. This had been necessity. A moment when survival demanded something unreasonable. They understood that what they had done could not be repeated easily. Conditions had aligned too perfectly. Desperation, terrain, enemy expectation, and timing had converged once. That was enough. War would move on, as it always does, absorbing anomalies into its endless appetite for explanation. But for those few days, reality had slipped. And in that slip, a weapon that should never have existed had changed everything. What followed after the engagement was not silence, but pressure. Slow, invisible, and relentless. The battlefield moved on, but the consequences of what had happened did not. Enemy forces reorganized. Routes shifted. Entire sectors were reclassified as high risk without anyone fully understanding why. On the surface, it looked like caution. Beneath it, it was fear disguised as procedure. Intelligence officers compared reports late into the night, trying to reconcile damage patterns with known weapons. Engineers ran simulations that failed repeatedly. Commanders adjusted formations in ways that subtly contradicted existing doctrine. None of these changes were dramatic enough to attract attention on their own. Together, they formed a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone wrong in the enemy's understanding of control. For the men who had operated the weapon, survival was not relief. It was exposure. They were questioned individually, casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. Officers asked about enemy movements, morale, terrain conditions. No one asked directly about the weapon. Direct questions create records. Records create responsibility. Responsibility invites consequences. So the truth remained fragmented, scattered across memories and half-statements that never quite connected. The unit itself ceased to exist as a coherent group. Transfers were issued. Assignments changed. Some were sent to quieter sectors. Others were pushed into high-risk operations where casualty rates erased history efficiently. This was not punishment. It was containment. Armies have always known how to bury anomalies without acknowledging them. The weapon, though physically destroyed, had created a strategic infection. The idea that improvised force could outperform standardized power was dangerous. If it spread, it undermined hierarchy. It suggested that doctrine was optional, that survival could justify deviation. Institutions cannot allow that belief to circulate freely. So the story was never told officially. Not because it was shameful, but because it was inconvenient. Meanwhile, the enemy continued to adapt to a threat they could not name. Training emphasized dispersion. Command vehicles increased distance from the front. Reconnaissance intensified in broken terrain. These changes reduced efficiency but increased perceived safety. The psychological impact outlived the physical weapon. Fear does not require understanding. It only requires uncertainty. On the friendly side, whispers circulated among frontline troops. Stories of impossible hits. Armor killed from the wrong direction. Vehicles disabled without warning. These stories grew with retelling, as all such things do. But even exaggerated, they carried a core truth. The battlefield was not as predictable as command wanted it to be. And unpredictability is contagious. Some units began improvising more aggressively. Not replicating the weapon that was impossible, but questioning limitations. Using tools incorrectly. Repositioning assets creatively. Breaking minor rules in pursuit of survival. Most of these efforts failed. A few succeeded. Each success reinforced the same dangerous lesson. High command responded with tighter control. Regulations thickened. Oversight increased. The system reasserted itself as systems always try to do. But it never fully recovered its previous confidence. Because somewhere in its structure was now a known unknown. Proof that under the right conditions the rules could collapse. For the men involved, the long-term effects were deeply personal. Nightmares returned not of the explosions, but of the waiting. Of the moments before firing, when everything balanced on a single decision. Some avoided speaking about it entirely. Others spoke too much, but only in fragments, jokes, or metaphors. No one told the full story, because telling it required admitting how close they had come to dying by their own creation. Time passed. The war moved toward its conclusion. New technologies emerged. Larger weapons, more refined doctrines, cleaner narratives. The improvised field gun faded further into obscurity. Yet traces remained. In obscure after-action reports with redacted sections. In technical memos proposing countermeasures to atypical penetration events. In training warnings about unexpected recoil dynamics, written by officers who could not say where the lesson came from. Historians later would dismiss such details as anomalies, clerical errors, or battlefield exaggeration. And they would not be entirely wrong. History prefers patterns, not exceptions. But war is built from exceptions. The weapon's true legacy was not destruction. It was disruption. It forced two opposing systems to confront the same uncomfortable truth. Control is fragile. No matter how advanced the technology, no matter how rigid the doctrine, the battlefield remains a human space. And humans, under pressure, invent. As the months went on, one of the original crew members was wounded in an unrelated engagement. While recovering, he was interviewed for a morale assessment. When asked what he thought had helped him survive the war so far, he gave an answer that was recorded and later ignored. He said that survival had nothing to do with bravery or obedience. It came from recognizing the moment when the situation demanded something unreasonable, and having the courage to do it anyway. That statement never made it into any official summary. It didn't fit. By the time the war ended, the weapon existed only as a rumor buried under victory narratives and casualty statistics.
No photograph survived.
No schematics were preserved. No medals were awarded for its use. But its influence lingered in subtle ways, shaping how future conflicts would be fought, even if no one admitted the source. The men returned to civilian life carrying a secret they rarely articulated. They had seen the system fail and filled the gap themselves. That knowledge never fully fades. It changes how you see authority, how you see danger, how you see possibility. The field gun that became something else was gone, but the line it crossed remained, etched into memory. And once a line like that is crossed, it can never truly be erased. It only waits, dormant, for the next moment when necessity forces someone else to ask an impossible question and decide whether survival is worth the risk of answering it. By the time the war began to tilt decisively toward its conclusion, the event itself had already been dissolved into something less dangerous than truth. It was no longer an incident, no longer a tactic, no longer even a rumor that could be clearly traced. It became a distortion, a statistical irregularity buried in reports, a strange cluster of losses that analysts explained away using language designed to reassure rather than reveal. Victory narratives have no room for accidents that expose fragility. They require inevitability. And what happened with the improvised weapon was the opposite of inevitable. It was unlikely, unstable, and deeply human. That made it threatening long after the last shot was fired. In post-war assessments, entire weeks of combat were summarized with clean arrows and simplified outcomes. The terrain where the engagement occurred was described as contested, then secured, then forgotten. The destroyed vehicles were counted, categorized, and attributed to conventional causes. No one wanted to ask how infantry had achieved effects normally reserved for heavy artillery. Asking that question risked uncovering others. For the men who had been there, reintegration into normal military structure felt unreal. Orders once again followed logic. Weapons behaved as expected. Training returned to procedure and repetition. But something fundamental had shifted internally. They had seen what happened when procedure ran out and imagination stepped in. That awareness created distance. They followed orders but no longer believed in their completeness. They trained but recognized the limits of training. They understood, perhaps better than any doctrine writer, that the battlefield would always present conditions no manual could predict. This understanding was isolating. It separated them quietly from those who still believed war was primarily a problem of planning rather than adaptation. Some of them tried to explain this to others cautiously, indirectly. They talked about flexibility, about not over-trusting equipment, about listening to intuition under pressure. Most listeners nodded politely and moved on. Armies value lessons that can be standardized. What they had learned could not be. It depended on fear, timing, and the willingness to accept consequences without permission. Meanwhile, the enemy conducted its own reckoning. Internal reviews acknowledged unexplained failures without assigning blame. Engineers proposed hypothetical weapons to explain the damage, none of which matched reality but all of which justified new funding and development. In this way, the improvised weapon achieved a kind of afterlife. It did not exist, yet it influenced future designs. Armor was reinforced in areas that should not have been vulnerable. Vehicle layouts were reconsidered. Commanders became more cautious about clustering assets. The irony was never acknowledged. The response to a non-existent weapon reshaped real ones. Fear, when left undefined, becomes extremely productive. Years later, fragments of the story surfaced independently. A veteran mentioning an impossible recoil during a recorded interview. A damaged photograph showing a weapon configuration that didn't match any known system. A classified memo declassified accidentally, containing a reference to non-standard infantry deployed high-caliber engagement. None of these fragments were enough on their own. Together, they hinted at something historians would later debate endlessly without resolution. And perhaps that was appropriate. Some events resist clean explanation because explaining them would require admitting how thin the line between order and chaos truly is. The men who survived aged quietly. Some carried injuries that never healed properly. Others carried memories that surfaced without warning, not of violence, but of decision. Of the moment they chose to act without authorization, without certainty, without any guarantee except that an action meant death. That choice defined them more than any medal ever could. When asked about the war, they spoke in generalities. They talked about luck, about comrades, about endurance. They did not talk about the weapon, not because they were sworn to secrecy, but because language failed them. How do you explain that you survived because you broke the rules so completely that the rules themselves ceased to matter? How do you admit that for a brief moment, The structure everyone depended on collapsed, and you filled the gap with something crude, dangerous, and effective. The truth is uncomfortable. It suggests that under extreme pressure, systems are only as strong as the people willing to step outside them. And that idea is as dangerous in peace as it is in war. The legacy of the weapon was not tactical. It was philosophical. It challenged the belief that superiority comes only from better equipment and clearer hierarchy. It demonstrated, briefly and violently, that survival can depend on the courage to attempt what should not work. That lesson never disappears. It waits. It reappears whenever doctrine fails and someone, somewhere, looks at a broken tool and asks a forbidden question. Long after the battlefield was reclaimed by grass and silence, that question remained unanswered, echoing softly through future conflicts. What happens when necessity demands something impossible and someone is desperate enough to try? The final truth of the weapon did not belong to the battlefield or to tactics or even to history as it is usually written. It belonged to memory, fractured, unreliable, and shaped by the need to survive what should have been unsurvivable. Years after the war ended, when uniforms were folded away and weapons were displayed behind glass, the men who had carried that moment inside them understood something few others ever would. The most dangerous thing they had created was not metal or force, but proof. Proof that under enough pressure, the architecture of war could be bent by hands that were never meant to touch it. Civilian life offered no place to store that knowledge comfortably. It surfaced at odd moments. In factories, when machines vibrated too hard and too long. In construction sites, when improvised supports held more weight than they should. In quiet rooms, when a single decision suddenly felt heavier than all the rules surrounding it. They had learned that certainty was fragile, and once that lesson is learned, it never fully unlearns itself. Some of them tried to bury the memory by embracing structure completely. Routine, order, predictability. They followed rules obsessively, as if discipline could override experience. Others went the opposite direction. They distrusted systems instinctively, preferring intuition, redundancy, and personal judgment over procedure. Both responses came from the same source. They had seen what happens when the system runs out of answers. They had been the answer briefly, and it terrified them. As decades passed, technology advanced beyond anything they could have imagined. Precision-guided weapons, digital targeting, automated decision-making. War became cleaner on paper, more distant in presentation. Analysts spoke of battles as datasets. Losses were numbers. Engagements were simulations. And yet, quietly, the same fundamental vulnerability remained. Every system, no matter how advanced, still depended on assumptions. And assumptions fail fastest under pressure. Somewhere in a modern conflict, long after these men were gone, another unit would face a problem no doctrine could solve. Different terrain, different technology, same equation, limited time, limited options, high stakes, and someone would look at an object not designed for the task and wonder if it could be forced to serve anyway. That is the real inheritance of the weapon. Not replication, but recurrence. Not the device, but the decision. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes in moments like these. Improvisation returns whenever necessity outpaces permission. The reason the original weapon never entered official records is not because it was ineffective, but because it was too effective in the wrong way. It demonstrated that control is conditional. That authority depends on circumstances behaving as expected. And when they don't, authority must either adapt or be ignored. Institutions survive by pretending this is not true. Soldiers survive by knowing it is. In the end, the story resists closure because it was never meant to have one. There was no final report, no concluding assessment, no lesson learned officially endorsed. The men carried the ending themselves, each in a slightly different form. For some, it was pride tempered by fear. For others, guilt balanced by necessity. For all of them, it was the understanding that survival sometimes demands crossing a line you cannot uncross afterward. That line does not appear on maps. It is not marked by orders. You only recognize it when you step over it and realize the world did not end. It simply changed. The field gun that refused to remain artillery vanished physically. but conceptually it never left the battlefield. It exists wherever someone is forced to choose between obedience and extinction, wherever the rules stop offering protection, wherever creativity becomes a weapon of last resort. That is why stories like this are uncomfortable. They do not fit neatly into heroism or tragedy. They occupy the space in between, where humans act not because they are brave, but because they are cornered. And that space is far more common than history admits. The war ended. The world rebuilt. New conflicts replaced old ones. But the quiet lesson endured, passed not through manuals or medals, but through instinct. When everything fails, when certainty collapses, when survival demands an answer that should not exist, someone will always be willing to try. And when they do, they will not think of it as history being made. They will think of it as the only way forward. That is where this story truly ends. Not in the past, but in the future moments it silently prepares us for. Because the most dangerous weapons are not the ones we design intentionally, but the ones we create when we believe there is no other choice.